Welcome! In this video, we will be identifying currency exposures by reviewing 6 scenarios. In each scenario, we will identify whether it represents a transaction exposure, a translation exposure, or an economic exposure. Before we start, let's review the 3 types of exposures. As you know, a transaction exposure means the degree to which the value of contractual transactions can be affected by currency fluctuations. Economic exposures measure change in the present value of all projected future cash flows and contractual transactions resulting from currency fluctuations. Translation exposure measures the extent of foreign exchange gains or losses an MNC experiences when translating financial statements of foreign subsidiaries to prepare consolidated financial statements. Scenario number 1. Daimler, a German-based automobile manufacturer, has sizable USD sales, which could affect the firm's value if the USD were to depreciate against the euro. Daimler managed his blank by building manufacturing facilities in the US. In this scenario, do you think it's a transaction exposure, economic exposure, or a translation exposure? Keep in mind that in this scenario, not all future cash flows associated with the manufacturing facilities are in contract yet. And we're talking about manufacturing facilities, not financial statements. Correct. Economic exposure. The manufacturing facilities will generate USD cash outflows to offset the USD cash inflows. Scenario number 2. Hawaiian macadamia nuts, based in Hilo, Hawaii, exports macadamia nuts worldwide, especially to Japan. By not hedging this particular blank, it made a substantial foreign exchange gain for its recent sales to Japan when the yen appreciated considerably. Is this a transaction exposure, an economic exposure, or a translation exposure? If you picked translation exposure, you would be correct. Hawaiian macadamia nuts made a substantial foreign exchange gain by not hedging its transaction exposure. Scenario number 3. Woodlands Inc., a US-based firm, has subsidiaries in Thailand, Malaysia, Korea, and Singapore. Because of its extensive blank, it suffered huge translation loss when the Asian financial crisis caused these countries' currency to depreciate sharply. If you were thinking translation exposure, you would be correct. Because of its extensive translation exposure, Woodland Inc. suffered huge translation losses when the Asian financial crisis caused these countries' currency to depreciate sharply. Scenario number 4. Tiffany, a jewelry company based in the US, has 600,000 euros in receivables, which it expects to collect in 3 months' time. The company decided to hedge this blank by selling euros forward. We know this is not translation exposure because there's no translation of financial statements here. You got it. Transaction exposures. Tiffany decided to hedge its transaction exposure by selling euros forward. Scenario number 5. Diageo, a UK-based alcohol firm, sells its alcoholic products worldwide, with the majority of its sales to the US. To minimize its blank to USD, Diageo decided to increase its USD-denominated debt. Since we're not talking about a particular transaction, but rather about the impact on projected future USD cash flows due to currency fluctuations, economic exposure is the correct answer. To minimize its economic exposure to USD, Diageo decided to increase its USD-denominated debt. Scenario number 6. Ford has engaged with Mazda Japan for its supplies of some automobile parts. Currently, Ford has outstanding payables to Mazda, totaling 30 million yen. Ford does not hedge this blank because it has a currency risk-sharing agreement with Mazda. Correct. Transaction exposure. Ford does not hedge its transaction exposure because it has a currency risk-sharing agreement with Mazda. Payables refer to supplies that have been purchased but have not yet been paid. They are transactions which are already in contract. Hence, it is transaction exposure. Let's recap. We read a series of scenarios and identified whether each scenario represented transaction exposure, a translation exposure, or an economic exposure. Thank you for joining me.